Okay, so what I'd like to do is review the digestive system. And we're going to go through the different parts of the digestive system using the models. But I also want to talk about not only just the anatomy, but the physiology of the digestive system. And so we're going to start at the beginning of the alimentary canal up here in this space. And what is this space called right here?
Oral cavity.
That's the oral cavity. Good. And there's a lot of digestive activities that occur in the oral cavity. The first one that occurs is the act of taking food and putting it in your mouth. And that's called ingestion. So ingestion is the first digestive activity that occurs in the oral cavity. What else is going on in the oral cavity?
Mechanical breakdown.
We have mechanical breakdown, physically taking that food and breaking it up into smaller pieces. What other structures within the oral cavity are going to contribute or be responsible for mechanical breakdown? The teeth. So the incisors, the canines, the premolars, and the molars all have different functions with regards to mechanical breakdown, but that's breaking stuff down, certainly, through the process of mastication. All of this is the oral cavity, but you have this big structure right here that takes up most of the space. What is that thing there?
The tongue.
That's the tongue. Does the tongue contribute to mechanical breakdown? Certainly it does. It pushes food in between the teeth. It pushes food up against the hard palate. So definitely it contributes to mechanical breakdown. What else about mechanical breakdown in there?
Saliva.
We need saliva in there. Good. I was trying to think of a way to introduce that in there, but thank you. We need saliva. What is saliva? How is that contributing to the process?
Has enzymes in it.
It does, but that's not necessarily mechanical breakdown. How does it contribute to mechanical breakdown? Well, it's soft. Have you ever tried to eat, a dry piece of food? Have you ever tried to eat something where your salivary glands just aren't working? It's tough to do. And so it softens the food. It moistens the food. It helps it mix it together into a homogeneous mass. Good. Where are those salivary glands located? Are they within the oral cavity? They're not. They're outside of the oral cavity. How many salivary glands are there? How many pairs of salivary glands?
3.
There's 3. This is the largest one right there. It's really superficial, right underneath the skin, by the ear. What is this one called?
Is it submandibular?
It's not the submandibular. It's the parotid gland. And so the parotid gland makes saliva. And how does that saliva get into the oral cavity?
Salivary duct.
Through a duct. Through this little duct right here, which is the parotid duct. And then it gets secreted into the oral cavity. And there are 2 other salivary glands, which are a little tougher to see here. But there is the submandibular gland. What does submandibular translate to? What does sub mean? Underneath. So it's underneath the mandible. Here's your mandible, your jawbone. It's underneath the mandible. And then there's the sublingual glands. What does that translate to? What does lingual mean? The tongue. So they're underneath the tongue. Good. Okay, mechanical breakdown. What else is going on in the oral cavity? What other digestive activities?
Chemical breakdown.
Chemical breakdown, or what we call, what's another word for chemical breakdown? That's just digestion. Okay, so when we're talking about digestion, we're talking about chemical breakdown. And there's 3 nutrients that we want to break down throughout the digestive tract. Let's go ahead and name those 3. What's one of them? These are all macromolecules. Somebody from over there, back in the back. Proteins. Good. Proteins, we want to break those down.
Lipids, carbohydrates.
Lipids are another one. And carbohydrates are another one. Those are the 3 macronutrients we want to break down. We want to digest in the alimentary canal. Which one is going to be digested in the oral cavity? Carbohydrates. Good. And what type of molecules are responsible for digesting nutrients, breaking them down into smaller components? Enzymes. Good. And where are the enzymes that break down carbohydrates in the mouth? Where are those enzymes coming from? The saliva. So the salivary glands are making this enzyme. And what's the specific name of the enzyme that's going to start breaking down these carbohydrates? Salivary amylase. Salivary amylase. AMYLASE. What do we need to break down carbohydrates to be able to move them into the bloodstream, to be able to absorb them? What are carbohydrates polymers of? A polymer is a long string of individual units. More specifically, carbohydrates are polysaccharides.
Monosaccharides.
We need to break them down into monosaccharides. Polysaccharide translates to many sugars. And the individual units that make up those polysaccharides are monosaccharides. Good, and that's what we need to break them down to absorb them into the blood. What's the most common monosaccharide in our diet? So I'll say this. We get most of our carbohydrates from starch. Starch is how plants store carbohydrates. And starch is made up of many individual sugars, many individual monosaccharides. What are the monosaccharides that make up a starch molecule?
Glucose.
Glucose. Good. Glucose. Now, is salivary amylase going to break off? Does salivary amylase contribute to a lot of carbohydrate digestion? It doesn't, and that's just because, it's not in the mouth very long. And the food doesn't have a lot of surface area at this point. The nutrients aren't that exposed. And so it starts to break it down a little bit, but, not a whole lot. And salivary amylase is actually only going to digest it into disaccharides, into 2 sugar units. So it's still not down into the monosaccharide level at this point. What other digestive activity occurs in the oral cavity? Mechanical breakdown, digestion.
Ingestion?
Ingestion, yep, ingestion, putting it in the mouth, sure, yep. Maybe there's some absorption that occurs, but proteins aren't broken down, carbohydrates aren't fully broken down. But maybe if you drink some glucose, well, even then, you can take a sublingual medication where it diffuses and it absorbs into the bloodstream. But the thing about those is that those are fat soluble. They kind of diffuse through the epithelium there. So I'm going to say not so much absorption.
It just seems like the oral cavity is focused on setting it all up to be absorbed.
It's setting it all up. It's mixing it all together into a homogeneous mass called a bolus. And what do we do with that bolus when we're done with it?
Swallow it.
We move it on down the line. Exactly. So the other digestive activity is propulsion. Propulsion.
What happens when you choke? Does that
Straight to choking, huh?
just,
Dang.
yeah.
Well, we're not quite there yet. We're not down in the esophagus yet, so we can come back to that. So the propulsion that's going to occur in the oral cavity is swallowing. And there's different phases of swallowing, and the first one is an oral phase. Do you have voluntary control over when you swallow something? You do. And that's the only voluntary propulsion that occurs in the digestive tract, is the decision to swallow. So you decide to swallow something, and then after this, it's kind of motor memory. But what happens is the tongue pushes that food up against the hard palate, and it starts to move it back to the back of the throat, back to the throat. What's the tongue made of?
Muscle.
What type of muscle? Skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. Okay, so there's muscles inside the tongue is under voluntary control. There's muscles outside the tongue that's under voluntary control, so we can control the movement of the tongue. So we decide to swallow, and this is a lot of motor memory, but the food gets pushed up against the hard palate, back to the soft palate, and what happens, what's this little thing right there? So hard palate, soft palate, then it becomes the little punching bag in the back of your throat.
Oh, the uvula.
That's the uvula. And that food bolus in the tongue moves it up. Why does it do that? Seals off the nasal cavity. Seals off the nasal cavity. So, if you're laughing and you're eating something, and this uvula is moving, moving up and down, then that allows food to get up, fluids into the nasal cavity, type of thing. And then all propulsion after that is voluntary. But basically what we want to do now is we want to take that food bolus and move it from the throat down into the esophagus. And the way it does this is super complicated. It's the most complicated reflex circuit in the body, this swallowing reflex at the level of the throat, the pharyngeal phase of swallowing. Let's identify the different parts of the throat, first of all. What's this upper part called? This part that's in connection with the nasal cavity. That's the nasopharynx. Then down below, right in back of the oral cavity, is the oropharynx. And then down by the larynx here is the laryngopharynx. And basically what happens, I've been doing some reading on this, and they don't completely understand it, but what it sounds like it happens is when that food bolus gets pushed to the back of the throat, that activates sensory receptors at the back of the throat. Maybe stretch receptors, maybe chemoreceptors. And that starts the whole reflex arc. So that sensory information goes to the brain, then it comes back, and there's a lot of skeletal muscles in our throat that are involved in this swallowing reflex. So it comes back and it activates those skeletal muscles around the throat, and those skeletal muscles sequentially contract and move that food down through the throat. At the same time, there are skeletal muscles that are connected to the hyoid bone and connected to the larynx here. And as part of that swallowing, and you can do this, you can palpate your larynx, your voice box. It's easier in males because it's more prominent, but these two flat plates of cartilage on the anterior, the front side of your neck, that's your larynx. And if you swallow, what happens to the larynx? It moves up. There's skeletal muscles that move it up. And so the larynx moves up and the tongue is pushing back, and that causes this structure. What's this part of the larynx right there, this little cartilage fold?
The epiglottis.
That's the epiglottis. Causes the epiglottis to fold down and cover the larynx. And why do we need that? What does that do?
That blocks the airways, so you're not.
Blocks the
swallowing
air
food
passageway.
down there.
Exactly. So you don't get food down the larynx and the trachea. If you do get fluid down there, you'll know it. It's a really violent reflex trying to cough that back up. Good. So the whole digestive tract is a mucous membrane, and it's an exposed body cavity, which means that it's lined by epithelium. What is the type of epithelium that lines the oral cavity? Stratified squamous epithelium. What is that type of epithelium good for? Protection. Protection from food, abrasion from food, chemical protection from the food. What type of epithelium lines the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx? Stratified squamous epithelium. And then we're going to get down into the esophagus. What type of epithelium lines the esophagus? Stratified squamous epithelium. What type of epithelium do we find within the salivary glands? What type of epithelium makes up the composition of the salivary glands, or at least the cells that are going to produce saliva? Simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal is really good at making products, so it's going to make those make that saliva. Anybody remember what this skeletal muscle is? It connects to, looks like it connects to the zygomatic bone and then down here to the mandible. The mandible is the insertion point, so the mandible is going to move. That movement occurs at your temporomandibular joint. That's the superficial masseter. So that's a muscle of mastication. It's a muscle of chewing. Good. Okay, so we just got done with the pharyngeal phase of swallowing, the phase of swallowing that moves food back to the throat and down into the esophagus. And I want to say that, the swallowing is a really complex reflex, and because of it, there's potential for stuff to go wrong. And any type of abnormality with swallowing is called dysphagia. Dysphagia. And a lot of that can happen at the pharyngeal phase, at the level of the throat. Maybe the nervous system, part of that circuit becomes deteriorated, anything like that, and that can leads to problems swallowing and can lead to choking. Then that food is down into the esophagus. And what is the job of the esophagus?
It's like a tunnel for the food.
It's a tunnel for the food, and the only job of the esophagus is to get food from the throat down through the thoracic cavity, past the heart, past the lungs, through the diaphragm, and into what?
The stomach.
Into the stomach. So the only job of the esophagus is propulsion. And let's take away the heart here. And this muscular tube right there is the esophagus. What do you notice about the location of the esophagus? What's this tube right there with these cartilage rings over it? That's the trachea. The esophagus is in back of the trachea. It's posterior to the trachea. How long is this food bolus staying in the esophagus?
4 to 8 seconds.
Yeah, just a few seconds. 4 to 8 seconds. How is that food bolus moving down through the esophagus? Does it move down by gravity? Maybe a little bit, but you can stand on your head and still get that food down through the esophagus.
It's propulsion?
What's the type of propulsion that moves the food down through the esophagus? It's the same movement that moves the food down through the entire digestive tract. Peristalsis. Peri means around, stalsis means constriction. So constriction around the food bolus. Anybody want to give a shot on how that peristalsis works? So you have a food bolus that moves down that's in the esophagus. How does that trigger this peristaltic reflex? What part of the nervous system are we involving at this point?
Parasympathetic?
There is some parasympathetic involvement, but remember that within the walls of the alimentary canal exists a separate nervous system that exists exclusively within the walls of the alimentary canal. What do we call that? That's the enteric nervous system. And a lot of this peristalsis is being driven by this enteric nervous system. So what starts the process of this peristalsis? What does the food bolus do in the esophagus that's going to trigger this reflex? All nervous system reflexes have to start out with a sensory stimulus. What's the sensory stimulus? Stretch of the esophagus. Stretch receptors are activated, and then what happens next? Those stretch receptors go in back of the food bolus, and they're going to activate motor neurons what are those motor neurons going to do? What part of the alimentary canal are those motor neurons going to act on? What part of the alimentary canal is actually responsible for contraction? Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa. It's the smooth muscle layers in there. So the sensory neurons are activated, and they activate motor neurons that cause contraction of the smooth muscle, specifically, in particular, the circular layer behind the bolus, and that pushes it down. Then the bolus moves down, activates another stretch receptor, which acts back and causes contraction in back of the bolus. Good. What do we say? What type of epithelium lines the esophagus?
Stratified squamous.
Stratified squamous epithelium. This is, again, it's a mucous membrane. The esophagus is lined by mucus to help, lubricate it and help that food pass down through there. Where is that mucus coming from?
Goblet cells.
There's actually not goblet cells in the esophagus. It's stratified squamous epithelium. We don't find goblet cells within the stratified squamous epithelium. But you're right, goblet cells are producing the mucus everywhere inferior to that. This was part of your histology on the esophagus histology.
What was the question?
What structures are responsible for producing mucus in the esophagus? They're in the submucosal layer. Remember those you have esophageal glands in the submucosa that are going to produce that mucus, and then a little duct takes that and secretes it into the lumen of the esophagus. Cool. Okay, good. So the esophagus takes that food down, takes it through the diaphragm, which separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity. I'm going to remove this structure right here, which is the liver. Good. And the esophagus goes through the diaphragm, and it's going to take this food and move it into this container right here. What's this container?
Stomach.
That's the stomach. To do that, it has to get through a sphincter at the top of the stomach. What's that sphincter?
Lower esophageal sphincter.
Lower esophageal sphincter. Okay. There's also an upper esophageal sphincter that opens during that swallowing reflex. But here's the lower esophageal sphincter. So the lower esophageal sphincter pinches off this part of the stomach. What about down here at the, I guess, the pyloric region of the stomach? What sphincter do we find down there?
The pyloric sphincter.
That's the pyloric sphincter. And these sphincters, by default, are contracted. So, that keeps material within the stomach. What do we find within the stomach that we want to have contained there? What do we find inside the stomach? Is it empty?
Acid.
Acid. It is acidic, but that acid is part of a larger secretion that we call.
Chyme.
Not yet. What's the fluid that we find inside the stomach? What do we call that? Gastric juice. Yeah, gastric juice. And that gastric juice is highly acidic. Exactly. How long is food going to stay solid food? How long is solid food going to stay in the stomach?
2 to 4 hours.
About 2 to 4 hours. So we're getting down to business here. Okay, we're getting down to business. What digestive activities are going to occur in the stomach?
Absorption.
Maybe a little absorption. That's not the main goal. We really haven't broken stuff down yet. We haven't digested it down to the point where we can absorb it.
Mechanical breakdown.
Mechanical breakdown.
And chemical breakdown.
So we're going to have mechanical breakdown that occurs in there. And so the food is in there, and there's actually a third smooth muscle layer of the stomach. It's an oblique layer. And what that does is it causes this type of peristalsis that it's called grinding. And so you have the pyloric sphincter here, and this material that we want to turn into chyme gets pushed up against this pyloric sphincter. And so you have this kind of circulation going on there. You have this called this grinding. You're pushing it up against the stomach. It's mixing around, and it's contributing to mechanical breakdown. And that oblique smooth muscle layer has a large deal to do with that. So we're getting mechanical breakdown. We are getting propulsion as well. It's moving down here through peristalsis. But for material to move on from the stomach into the small intestine, we need to make it into this paste, break it down further into this paste that we call chyme. Okay. And once it gets in that liquid form, then as this material gets grinded around there, small amounts of that liquid can secrete through the pyloric sphincter and make their way into the small intestine. So we have mechanical breakdown, we have propulsion. What else do we have going on there? Any digestion occurring in the stomach? Where there's one nutrient that we're going to digest in the stomach. Proteins. And what is the enzyme in the stomach called that's going to break down this protein? And I will say, enzymes that break down proteins are generically called proteases. So what's the specific protease that's going to break down the proteins in the stomach? This sounds like a good tease question. Pepsin. Pepsin. Now, is pepsin just is pepsin made directly by the stomach, or how does pepsin get formed? So the cells of the stomach actually produce a precursor molecule called pepsinogen. And that's a protein, and it's a protein. And what happens to pepsinogen in an acidic environment? Part of it gets cleaved off and it gets converted to pepsin. So pepsin is formed in the stomach. And pepsin is going to start to break down proteins. What do we need to digest proteins for absorption to occur? What are proteins polymers of? Amino acids. So we need to break them down into individual amino acids. And I'm not sure pepsin does it. It cleaves off amino acids, but I think it might get it down to like the dipeptide level. It's not individual amino acids. We're looking at the mucosa layer here. And the mucosa layer is thrown into these folds. What do we call those folds?
Rugae.
Those are rugae. And what's the purpose of the rugae?
To expand.
It allows the stomach to expand. Good. It can fill with material and allows it to expand. Increases the capacity of the stomach. What also happens when that stomach stretches?
You feel full.
That information, that distension of the stomach, that sensory information goes up to the brain, to the hypothalamus, and it causes a feeling of satiety, a feeling full. The stomach is dotted by millions of little dots that lead their way down into these tubes that form what we call gastric glands. What type of epithelium lines these gastric glands and is responsible for producing gastric juice? It's the same epithelium that's going to line the small intestine and the large intestine. Simple columnar epithelium is producing this gastric juice. What stimulates these gastric glands to produce gastric juice? Because gastric juice is like a faucet, you want to turn it on and off when needed. You don't want to just be producing it, leave the water running all the time. So what are some things that can stimulate the secretion of gastric juice?
The thought and sight of food.
Just the sight and the thought of food.
And emotional distress.
So the sight and thought of food can stimulate gastric juice secretion. That travels, that's a conscious thing, and it goes down and it turns into a vagus nerve stimulation of the stomach. Emotional distress.
That was in one of the question things.
But was it an answer to one of the questions?
Yeah.
It was an answer, but was it the answer to the question?
I thought it was all of the answers. I thought you mentioned it in the videos.
Emotional distress actually inhibits gastric juice secretion.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah. Emotional distress has negative effects on the digestive system. So the sight and thought of food, stretch of the stomach. That stretch of the stomach causes gastric juice secretion.
Do you think that's why when we have dessert, we can feel more, like after we're full of dinner and then we want dessert? I think that's why we could actually eat dessert after we're full?
Yeah, maybe you have, maybe some of these folds are still not stretched out, you know, and you can stretch them out some more. In grad school, I did growth physiology in fish, and I did feeding experiments, periods of feed restriction, and then periods of, you know, unrestricted feeding, and I'll say this: a fish's stomach can really stretch. Like, it's surprising how many pellets of food can be inside of a fish's stomach. And I imagine those same properties apply to humans as well. You know, you can really stretch that stomach.
Could the fish get obese?
I wouldn't say obese, but they had different levels. Their livers really changed size based on the accumulation of glycogen in the liver. Their adipose, what we call their adipose index, changed a little bit. Yeah, we did periods of feed restriction and then refeeding. And you know, a lot of that went to muscle as well. So we were also feeding them their high protein diets, but there were carbohydrates in there, and you know, most fish aren't meant to eat carbohydrates, and so they did get some, you know, abnormal energy deposition. Good. Anything else about the stomach that I'm forgetting?
I was curious because when the upper or the lower esophageal sphincter, when that feels, you get the heartburn. Why does that happen more often when you eat like acidic things or spicy things?
Yeah, or if you consume too much alcohol, you know. By default, this lower esophageal sphincter is closed. And, you know, different chemical environments can weaken that sphincter or cause it to relax. So maybe it's susceptible to spicy foods, it causes it to relax. And it allows that gastric juice to go up there, up into the esophagus, and burn the lining of the esophagus, which we call heartburn, because, you know, it runs right behind the heart and it feels like it may be coming from the heart. Good. You guys hanging in there? Do you know we'd be getting this in depth here? This is a good review. So food gets grinded around there, and small amounts of that liquid chyme gets secreted through the pyloric sphincter. And I'm going to remove this right here, which is the transverse colon. I'm going to move the remainder of the small intestine there. So chyme moves from the stomach into this first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. Good. The duodenum is just this, it's the smallest portion. I don't know, it's like 8 to 12 inches. It forms this C, it forms a C shape. And the head of the pancreas sits in this C. So if you find the pancreas on a cadaver or on a surgery or anything like that, you can find the duodenum and vice versa. What is kind of the nickname that we give to the duodenum? It's the mixing bowl. We have a lot of stuff mixing together in the duodenum. And one of those is acidic chyme from the stomach. So that's something that's down there. What else do we have mixing in the duodenum? Pancreatic what?
Juice.
Pancreatic juice. Good. This is the pancreas. And the pancreas starts in the upper right quadrant, and then it kind of extends across the abdomen. The pancreas is a gland, and it's lined by simple cuboidal epithelium that's going to produce pancreatic juice. What do you guys know about that pancreatic juice? What's the pH of that pancreatic juice? Is it acidic, neutral, or basic? It's basic. It's alkaline. And why is that the case?
To neutralize the gastric juice.
We want to neutralize that acidic gastric juice. Exactly. What else is in that pancreatic juice? Maybe the most important thing. What's the main purpose of the small intestine? What are the two main digestive activities that occur in the small intestine? Food's going to be here for 3 to 5 hours. Digestion and absorption. Up until this point, we've had a little carbohydrate digestion in the mouth. We've had we've had protein digestion in the stomach. And so this is where the bulk of digestion is going to take place. One thing I forgot about the stomach. What else does that acidic environment do to help with protein digestion? Not only does it help in the formation of pepsin, but what does it do to those proteins that are making their way down into the stomach?
Straightens them out.
It causes them to unfold. It denatures them. And that gives the enzymes much better access at the chemical bonds that hold those amino acids together. Good. So we have pancreatic juice that has pancreatic enzymes in it, has digestive enzymes. What type of enzymes are we going to find there? What type of enzymes are going to break down carbohydrates? Amylases, so we pancreatic amylase. What do we call enzymes that break down proteins? Proteases, we're going to have proteases in there. And what type of enzymes break down lipids or triglycerides? Lipases. All of those digestive enzymes are going to get in there, and they're going to be mixed around in the small intestine. What's the other thing that's going to be mixed in there?
Bile from the liver.
Bile. Where's bile produced?
The liver.
The liver. And it travels from the liver down the, that's not very good here, but what's the duct that takes bile from the liver into the duodenum?
Bile duct.
The bile duct. Good. Where is excess bile stored?
The gallbladder.
The gallbladder. What does bile do? It's not involved in digestion directly. It's not an enzyme. It emulsifies fats. What does that mean? It breaks it down into smaller droplets. And why is that beneficial to take a fat globule that's basically a globule of triglycerides and break it down into smaller droplets to emulsify it? What's the magic word here?
Is it easier to absorb that way?
It increases the surface area. Increases the surface area of the triglycerides so those lipases can come and have easier access, more access to them. Good. How is all of that material getting mixed around in there? So mechanical breakdown does occur in the small intestine. How does that occur? What is that process called? It's from the smooth muscle layers that are doing it. But instead of just moving it straight down through the small intestine, which happens there, there's also another movement that goes on there, and it's this off-on contraction of the smooth muscles that causes chyme to move down, and then it moves it back, moves it down, moves it back. And it pinches it. It's mixing it together, moving it back and forth in here. Remember what that movement is called?
Is that protrusion?
Segmentation is what I'm looking for. Segmentation. And just because I can't help myself, something else that's going on here is, you have these simple columnar cells, and some of those cells are endocrine cells. We call these enteroendocrine cells, endocrine cells that we find in the intestine. And those are going to respond, they're going to release a hormone in response to proteins and fats. So they're kind of chemoreceptors. They detect proteins and fats, and then they're going to release a hormone in response to that. Anybody remember what that hormone is? Cholecystokinin, CCK. So big question on the study questions about that. And that CCK goes into the blood and it acts back on the pancreas, and what does it tell the pancreas to do? We have nutrients in the small intestine, so what do we want the pancreas to do? That's when we want the pancreas to release that pancreatic juice. You know, it's the same thing. We want to only turn it on when we need it. So CCK causes the secretion of pancreatic juice. Remember this question, does the effects of CCK match the stimulus? And the answer is yes. Because we're releasing pancreatic juice in response to those nutrients in the small intestine. And CCK also goes back and it causes contraction of the gallbladder, secreting bile in there. Good. Okay. So material moves on from the duodenum and it goes to the next spot, which is the
Starts with a J.
jejunum. I say DJ ilium for some reason is some that duodenum, jejunum, and then the ilium.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that'd be a pretty hip DJ name, right? DJ
Remember
ilium.
DJ Ivan from the Amoeba Sisters.
Whatever works. How long is the jejunum? I might get this wrong too, but I want to say 10 feet, 12 feet maybe.
8 feet.
8 to 12.
I don't know.
And what type of, so instead of that, you know, there is segmentation occurring, so it's being pinched, you know, it's spending a lot of time there. So that chyme is rubbing against the wall of the intestine, so we have a lot of digestion, and at the same time we have a lot of absorption. So we're moving, what did we say that we have to break carbohydrates down into for absorption to occur? Monosaccharides. So we're breaking down carbohydrates into monosaccharides. Those are moving across the intestinal wall and into the blood. We're breaking down proteins to individual amino acids, moving across the intestinal wall into the blood. And then we're breaking down triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. And that actually is a little more complicated. It gets put together in what we call this micelle, and then it actually moves into the bile, the biliary system, or the lymphatic system. Sorry, the lymphatic system before it goes to the blood. How does that chyme move through the small intestine? Does it just shoot straight through, or what does the wall of the intestine look like? It's actually going to spiral through the small intestine. So it rubs up against the intestinal wall. It spends more time there. How is it able to do that? What modifications of the small intestine allow that to occur? It's thrown into these circular folds. So the chyme moves and spirals through the small intestine. Any modifications of the mucosa layer of the, this is simple columnar epithelium in there, but any modifications of the mucosa layer that's going to help out with digestion and absorption? Is it just a straight tube in there? You have,
Little villi.
you have little fingers that are projecting out there, little villi. And those villi are lined by simple columnar epithelium. Why do we have those villi on there?
To increase surface area.
Increased surface area. And then we have individual simple columnar cells, and what modifications do we find on the apical side of those simple columnar cells up on the lumen side? Microvilli. What's the purpose of microvilli? I have two different important things.
Secret something.
surface area.
It increases surface area.
I forget what it secretes.
Do pancreatic enzymes, are they responsible for all of the digestion?
No.
No, in fact, the final digestion occurs by what we call brush border enzymes, enzymes that are secreted by these microvilli. And that breaks it down into monosaccharides and individual amino acids and all that kind of stuff. Good. So let's say we have a glucose, and that glucose is absorbed from the jejunum into the blood supply. Where's the first place that glucose goes? It's in the blood. Where's the first place that it goes? It goes to the liver. And it gets there, what's the circulatory system called that's going to take nutrients from the intestines and take them to the liver? That's the hepatic portal system. Hepatic portal system. And the liver's going to have a choice. It can either secrete that, it can let that glucose pass into the blood, in which case your blood sugar goes up, or it can take that and it can put it in a storage form. What's the storage form that the liver stores glucose? Glycogen. And now we're entering the territory of the endocrine system, because all of this is going to be under the control of the pancreas. The pancreas has a digestive function, secreting pancreatic juice. It also has an endocrine function. And its endocrine function is to regulate blood sugar. And it releases either insulin or glucagon to do that, and the liver's a major effector organ for that to happen. Good. Okay, so that material goes through the jejunum, into the ileum, digestion, absorption is going on, and then next, it's going to go into the large intestine. But to get there, it has to go through a little valve, a little sphincter. What's that sphincter called that separates the ileum from the first part of the large intestine, which is the cecum?
Ileocecal valve.
Ileocecal valve. So it goes through the ileocecal valve and into the cecum. And the cecum just receives this information from the small intestine, this material. What's the little appendage that comes off of the cecum? Little lymphoid organ that comes off the cecum, can cause real problems. The appendix. Good. Okay, so now we're in the large intestine, and let's just go through the different parts. What's this part here?
Ascending colon.
Ascending colon.
Transverse colon.
Transverse colon.
Descending colon.
Descending colon, and then it takes this weird S-like turn.
Sigmoid.
Sigmoid colon. Then to the rectum and the anus. How long is material going to stay in the large intestine?
For several hours up to a couple days.
Hours to days, yep. And what's the main goal of the large intestine? We've done almost all the nutrient absorption has occurred by
Water
now.
absorption.
Water absorption. Electrolyte absorption, any remaining electrolytes. Why are we absorbing water at this point? What's the goal? What do we need to do?
Create feces.
We need to create feces, absolutely. And so we need to compact that into a semi-solid feces mass. And we need to extract water from it to do that. And so that material is going to move back. What are these individual pouches called that make up the colon?
Posture.
Those are hostra. And you have this movement, this segmentation-like movement called hostral churning that occurs within here. And it's basically pinching this material in the hostra, and it's causing the material to move against the wall, absorb water, and all that kind of stuff. What happens if material moves too quickly through the large intestine? Diarrhea. they used to have this wiener dog who used to eat all sorts of bad stuff and get bacterial infections. And it would almost always result in diarrhea because that, those bacteria irritate the large intestine and cause that material to rush through there. What about if material takes too long in the large intestine? Too much water absorption and constipation, a real hardened feces that maybe it doesn't move through. What's another important part of the large intestine? It has mucus layers in there. But what's another really interesting thing going on that we find in that mucus layer of the large intestine that we really need for our overall health?
Oh, bacteria.
That's where the gut microbiome is located. Bacteria, viruses, and fungi are in that mucus layer. They're in the small intestine too, but also in the large intestine. And what do those bacteria live off of? Has anybody seen in the stores stuff called prebiotics? If you go in the digestive health section of the co-op or something like that, they have prebiotics.
Yes.
So mostly different types of fiber. And so those prebiotics and fiber, dietary fiber, indigestible material to us is what these bacteria use for their food. So we give these bacteria a nice warm environment to live in. We give them food in the form of that fiber, which is why dietary fiber, one of the reasons, is so important to get in our diet. What do those bacteria do for us? This is a symbiotic relationship.
They keep us healthy. They keep the E.
good
coli
bacteria.
at bay, the C. diff at bay.
They definitely keep, we want that bacteria to be a certain population of bacteria. And when we have a healthy gut population, it prevents pathological bacteria like C. diff from taking over. Exactly. These bacteria also produce vitamins that we can't produce on our own. Some of the vitamin Ks, some of the vitamin Bs, they're going to produce those vitamins. One of the main causes of irritable bowel syndrome is when the gut microbiome gets thrown off. What
causes it to be thrown off?
What causes it to get thrown off? Diet, a lot of times. People have very specific diets that are beneficial for the gut microbiome. You can take stuff like aspirin or anti-inflammatories like that can wipe out the gut microbiome. I took a cold medicine. I had a cold earlier in the year and had all this throat stuff, and I took Robitussin. And I probably took too much Robitussin. And the cold got better, but then I had digestive issues. I'll just tell you, I had, constipation, diarrhea, gas, gurgling, all this kind of uncomfortable stuff for like 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. And I finally put it together, and I think that Robitussin threw off my gut microbiome. There was too much of it. It killed that good bacteria. And that takes weeks to reestablish.
So what if fecal transplant, take care of that?
I would
right
have taken a
away?
poop pill. If at that point, digestive issues are not fun.
Does it
You know?
cure irritable bowel syndrome?
I
Can
think
do
it
that?
might help, but you got to get to the root of the problem of what's causing it. And a lot of that is diet. But so one of the things that the bacteria do is they maintain the health of the intestinal lining. Those epithelial cells are joined tightly together by tight junctions. And that prevents undigested material and bacteria from slipping in between the cells and into the blood. And they're finding that the gut microbiome is super important for maintaining the integrity of that epithelial barrier. So if the gut microbiome gets off, those tight junctions break and materials can get into the blood. They call that leaky gut. And then it can go other places and cause inflammation in other areas of the body. Are there a lot of white blood cells? Does the immune system have a strong presence in the digestive system? There's more white blood cells in the gut than anywhere else in the body. And they are living in that mucosa layer of the small and large intestine. And what they're finding is there's a lot of talk between the gut microbiome and those white blood cells. So a healthy gut microbiome is important for a healthy immune response there. And then they're also finding with that gut microbiome that they can produce chemicals that make their way up to the brain. Maybe they get there through the vagus nerve. Maybe they go into the blood. And that can affect mental health. It has impacts maybe on Alzheimer's, on obesity, on all sorts of stuff. So super important. Cool. Okay, and then finally we get that that feces that goes back to the rectum. What's the job of the rectum?
To store poop.
It's to store poop. Yes, it is to store feces. But you know that rectum gets filled up, and what happens when it gets filled up?
And don't you feel like you have to go?
How come? This is a nervous system reflex. It activates stretch receptors. Those stretch receptors are activated, and it triggers the defecation reflex. And it comes back down, and it causes smooth muscle in the sigmoid colon and the rectum to contract. The internal anal sphincter, smooth muscle band around the anus, what does it cause that to do? The defecation reflex. To open. Okay? So, you know, those are all going to cause you to defecate. If it's not convenient to defecate, what can you do to stop that defecation from happening? You feel the urge to defecate, that smooth muscle's contracting, it wants to go out. You have one little band of skeletal muscle that wraps around the anus that's going to help you out. The external anal sphincter. And that's skeletal muscle, so it's under voluntary control. If you pucker your bunghole, that's what you're doing. You're puckering that external anal sphincter. How come babies just have no control over when they poop? They haven't figured out that external anal sphincter yet. They haven't made that connection between the brain and that
It's
contraction.
voluntary, so
Ah,
they
and
have
they're terrorists, so.
Awesome. That was a really good review of the digestive system. The endocrine system plays right into this. The pancreas regulating blood sugar. The thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is going to act on almost all cells of the body. And what's the thyroid hormone going to do to individual cells? We probably haven't got there yet, but
It regulates how much energy each cell uses.
thyroid hormone is the main metabolic hormone of the body, and it acts on cells and it stimulates cellular respiration, which is taking glucose and converting it into ATP.
Does the endocrine system talk about the lymph nodes?
Endocrine system and the lymphatic system are different things. The lymphatic system, the spleen, the lymph nodes, that has major interaction with the immune system. Okay, any other questions?